All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I am Robert Van Branken. I'm the launch and audit specialist here at the Podcast Consultant. Today, we're going to talk about analytics that matter, understanding your podcast metrics. Before we get started, I just want to let everyone know that if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. If for whatever reason I don't have an opportunity to answer your question at the end, which after I'm done with the presentation today, we'll have like a little bit of a Q&A, you can always reach out to me at robert@thepodcastconsultant.com, or you can just reach out to us in general at podcast@podcastconsultant.com. But I will have an opportunity to answer questions at the end. That's just if you need to follow up with us on anything. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So just a little bit about what we're going to talk about, just agenda breakdown. So we're going to talk about downloads versus listens, completion rate benchmarks, realistic growth expectations, download performance context, monetization thresholds, geographic and demographic insights, platform performance comparison, subscriber growth patterns, and then finally, we're going to talk about an actionable response framework, which hopefully that's going to be a great takeaway for everyone who's interested in joining today, because it'll give you a little bit of a plan on how to analyze your data and then kind of what to do about it afterwards. So, all right. I do want to just give a little bit of an introduction of myself, just so you know like where this information is coming from. So once again, my name is Robert Van Branken. I'm the launch and audit specialist for the Podcast Consultant. I'm a very experienced producer. I've done over 1,000 episodes now as a producer or editor, which seems crazy. But I've been doing this for about 7 years or so, and so it adds up quick. A lot of my work has been featured in publications. New York Times and Forbes are chief among them. So that's always really exciting. I've joined the Podcast Consultant back in 2019 as an audio editor. Like I said, I'm a very experienced audio editor. And so I started off doing some of our most influential finance shows, Capital Allocators, First Rounds in Depths, and on and on. Currently, I'm the launch specialist, like I said, which basically means anyone who wants to come to start a podcast with us from scratch, we basically walk them through all the steps and making sure that they're set up to succeed. I also do podcast audits. So people are looking to fix their like stagnant growth, like if they kind of have plateaued and they're not really sure that they're doing everything right, we kind of like try to realign their goals. And a lot of what we're talking about today is what I talk about with people who are doing their audits, because a big problem that people have is they don't really know how to look for their data. They don't know what data to look for. And then once they have all the information, they don't really know what to do with it and how that can affect like their podcast growth plans. So my experience in there has really helped me put together some of the info in this webinar. But yeah, like I said, as a launch consultant, I've launched dozens of shows through TPC, including shows for Franklin Templeton, Columbia Business School, and a lot of really major finance organizations. So that's a little bit about me, just so you know where some of this information is coming from. And once again, I want to let you know at the end we'll have a chance to answer any questions. So if I'm going through kind of fast, or you miss anything or need clarification, you can always reach out to us via email. Again, it's just robert@thepodcastconsultant.com. But otherwise, I'll be able to answer live with you here today. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is downloads versus listens. So a lot of times in our industry, people will call raw download numbers, they'll refer to it as a vanity metric, which is true. And there's a reason they say that, but it is a little bit harsh because I don't think you're necessarily being vain wanting to know, what your download numbers are. But the reason they say that is because it's not really that helpful in general. And we're going to talk about today what some of the more helpful metrics are. But the hard truth is that the raw download numbers that you see can include like bots scraping your RSS feed. So I don't know if any of you guys have gotten these kind of like spam mass emails where they're like trying to help you with clips or this or that. The reason they get your emails, they have like these bots that go through and get like the email that's associated with your RSS feed, and through that process, it counts as a download. So a lot of times, what you're seeing is not entirely accurate. There is basically an industry standard that's the Interactive Advertising Bureau is what it's called, and they measure all sorts of like media stats, and they have developed podcast analytics standards, and you can get, as a hosting platform, get certified for IAB, which gives you a much better understanding of accurate numbers, because they won't include things like bots. They can filter all that out, and they don't include things like if you play twice from the same computer, like it's not going to be actually played twice. So things like that are very helpful. When you're looking for hosts, I would definitely look for hosts that are IAB certified. And a lot of times you'll see like a little check mark in your stats where you can filter your IAB downloads versus your regular downloads. So if you do want to just get an accurate count of downloads, that would be a great way to do it. But like I said, they do refer to that as a vanity metric for a variety of reasons. But what's really going to be most engaging is what's going to be the most important thing to measure is engagement, excuse me. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of what are the most engaging things. So something to keep in mind is that the average podcast only actually gets about 27 downloads per episode. Now, I will say that that is a little bit skewed because there's 4 to 5 million podcasts that are currently active, which basically means in the last 60 or 90 days that someone has put out an episode. And among those, it's mostly hobbyists who mostly aren't doing things right and not promoting things right. So they get hardly any listeners. So it is kind of skewed in that sense. But also downloads can be also confusing because your downloads versus plays are different. So somebody might subscribe to your show and then that triggers like automatic downloads, especially if they're using Apple Podcasts. It's kind of the default. So if someone subscribes, every time you put out an episode, they're going to count as a download, whether they listen to it or not. Listens / plays can also be complicated. Like I said, IAB, it does have some standardization for what downloads are, but just the nomenclature, what people use, the language that people use, it varies wildly from host to host. So they might say you have this amount of listens, while someone else might say you have this amount of plays. So you want to be careful and make sure that you're getting those terms defined. And usually they will define them on whatever RSS feed host you're using. So for example, I think Spotify is like, if you're more than 30 seconds, somebody has listened to it, then that is considered a play, and it might be slightly different with Apple, etc. So it gets a little bit complicated, but what we're going to talk about down the line is completion rates and listener behavior. And those are really where you measure engagement. The other really important ways to measure engagement is actually outside of the podcast. So like if you're getting a lot of comments on social media, if you're getting a lot of comments on your posts, that's a great way of measuring engagement. I will say that Spotify somewhat recently rolled out for everybody the ability to get comments. So you can now, if you sign up for Spotify for Creators, which is Spotify's kind of internal RSS feed host, people can leave comments and then you basically get an email every time there's comments. So you can see engagement there, which is kind of a new thing. It's probably going to be a few years before people start to realize that they can do that and you actually be able to measure engagement that way. YouTube is also another great way because everybody knows to leave YouTube comments. Although I will say there is a lot of spam in YouTube comments as well. So keep that in mind. But yeah, that's a little bit about downloads versus listens. And again, if you have any questions at the end, feel free to ask. Otherwise, reach out to me. I do just want to say also that this meeting is recorded. So if anyone ended up joining up late, we will be posting it as soon as possible on our YouTube channel. So you can always watch and share with other people and go back and listen. So just FYI there. All right, yeah. So now we're going to move on to completion rates benchmarks. So this is essentially your content quality report card. So it shows whether people find your material valuable enough to actually stick around into the end. So if you look at like the industry-wide data of podcast metrics, like the average completion rates are usually about 50 to 70. So if you're above 70, that's really excellent. If you're going above 80, you're definitely doing something right. You're making a very strong connection to your audience. So this is going to be way more important than just looking at just what your download numbers are. And these are averages. So like if you're not hitting these numbers, it may be an indication that you need to change things, but it may not. If you're generally within that range, that's probably good. But yeah, it is just common that people start an episode and they don't finish it for whatever reason. But again, these are diagnostic tools, so it could indicate a potential issue if you're really low. So like specifically, it can have to do with like your content structure, your pacing, or if you're even targeting the relevant audience. So for example, if you see people dropping off like at the 10-minute mark, maybe you're like doing way too long of an introduction, which almost every podcast is guilty of. In my opinion, there's no real need to go past 5 minutes for an intro. I mean, it kind of depends on the type of show you have and your segments, but usually you want to get right into the main content. And that's one of the biggest things that I see when I'm looking at completion rates. So when I'm doing audits, a lot of times people will drop off really early. And that's why, because they're just like, I can't take it anymore. Just get to the content, So that's just an example, though. There's a ton of reasons why you might have lower completion rates that you want. But in general, just use your completion rates as like your primary content quality indicator. They'll guide you towards creating episodes that truly serve your audience from start to finish. So it does take a little bit of detective work. I will say something that has helped with people that I've done audits with is they'll do like an audience survey. Now, it's hard to get people to respond to a survey, so it depends on how big of your audience is, because usually like maybe 5 to 10% of people are actually going to do the survey. And that way you get a better sense of like, are the intros too long? You can ask that as a question, et cetera. So like, you can get a lot better answers that way. And just to reiterate what I was saying before about Spotify, they also have, if you sign up for Spotify for Creators, you can also do your own surveys under each episode. So you can get like instant feedback. But again, it's like so new of a feature that even a lot of people who use Spotify as a listening platform don't even know about that yet. So it's still early in the game, but if you want to try it, it's definitely worth trying. Spotify for Creators, you can use even if you don't use them as your main host. You can basically claim your podcast on there. And then they have all sorts of tools that you can access. We'll get to this later, but Apple Podcast for Creators works very similarly, as you can tell by the names being almost identical. Apple kind of copycatted that and is starting to put out similar features that Spotify for Creators currently has. And some of those things might be beneficial when we're talking about getting some engagement and then also getting feedback from your audience. So, all right, we'll move on to our next slide here, which is listen through rate. So this is how much an episode is consumed by a listener on average. So it's a little bit different. So it's basically the average percentage that your audience has listened through to the podcast. So it's very similar to completion rates, and a lot of people get this confused. I will say also that not every podcast host has access to both of these, but if you are on Apple Podcasts, which most people are, you can get this information really easily. And they also really have, good breakdowns, like listeners and engaged listeners, as you can kind of see in this graphic over here. But again, you also don't have to use them as your podcast host feed. It works very similar to Spotify for Creators, where you can basically claim the podcast on Apple Podcasts for Creators, and then you'll have access to all of this information. It works a little bit differently than it did, 5 to 10 years ago when you were working with Apple, and it's a much more user-friendly. And so I highly recommend that everybody does that. Basically, I'm happy to answer any questions or clarify this in a follow-up email or at the end. But basically, whatever email you have associated in your RSS feed with your show, you basically just add that to your Spotify for Creators account or your Apple for Creators account, and they'll send you an email to that email with like a code. You type in the code, and then you have access to all of your data. And it is retroactive. So if you've already been on Apple or Spotify, all of your data is still being stored, and then you now have access to this and then all of the tools. So I highly recommend that. As we talk about gathering analytics and figuring out what to do with it, it's really important that you have access to all those, because those are going to give you some of the best information out there. So just want to make sure that everyone's clear on that before we go on. So it really is one of the gold standards of podcast engagement. So it's really important to look at. So a good listener rate should be about 90% or higher, but obviously you can use like a letter grade scale to kind of determine like what works best. But yeah, generally if you're getting 90%, like that's going to be great. And you can also measure it over time and see how, as your show progresses and how your episodes get better produced, or, you get better at being podcasting, seeing if that makes a difference, seeing over time, how your structure, your guests, whatever it might be that changes from week to week or month to month, however you want to measure it. The listen through rate is a really good way to measure engagement, much more than, straight downloads like we had mentioned. So yeah, and a high listen through rate shows that your content holds attention throughout the entire episode, which indicates that it's a great audience to content fit. And it predicts the likelihood that people will return for future episodes. The real value of listen rates will help you like identify the weak points in your episode and your structure, like I was saying. So if you notice certain drop-offs, you can analyze what's happening in those moments. Did you have an episode that had, a guest that just goes off on tangents too much? Did you have a few episodes where your mic wasn't hooked up properly? It was just bad audio. So again, you do have to do a little bit of detective work when you get these numbers and we have these analytics, but it's just really important that you get them and start doing the analysis so that you can make improvements as your podcast goes on. All right, so let's move on to the next one here. Realistic growth expectations. So setting benchmarks that make sense. One of the biggest mistakes that podcasters make is comparing their show's growth to like viral outliers or categories in podcasting, completely different categories to their own. So you can't necessarily just like look at the latest celebrities' new podcast and see how many followers, et cetera, they have. That's kind of obvious, but I think a mistake that some people make more regularly is they have, a sports and politics podcast and they're comparing it to a tech podcast or whatever. All the growth rates are very different and the audience is very different. So it's important that you pick someone who's like a competitor of yours, maybe not like the number one podcast in that genre, but somebody who is about level with you or maybe like a little bit more successful, and kind of use that as a way to compare. You can't always see exactly what people's growth numbers are, but if you look at things like reviews is a great way to count. So like reviews are public. You can see on Spotify what their star rating is and how many people have starred their show. And then you can look at the ratings on Apple Podcasts to kind of get a sense of the popularity. Then, of course, if they have a YouTube channel, you can see like their YouTube channel numbers because those are usually public as well. So that's all really important to know. Um, it matters because so if you're hosting like a health and wellness show and you're expecting like technology growth rates, you're setting yourself up for frustration and potentially making like poor strategic decisions and just like freaking out and like changing things, even though it doesn't necessarily need to. Um, but yeah, I would set your growth rates targeted on your specific niche, which you can do a little bit of research and find where that benchmark should be. But in general, you just want to make sure that like when you're making comparisons and you're setting benchmarks for growth, that you're comparing them to shows that are actually applicable. And what we'll talk about down the line too is like where the current state of podcasting is and kind of like what to expect in a little bit more detail. So it's a little bit nuanced there, but I hope that helps somewhat. So yeah, download, performance, context. So this is kind of what I was alluding to. You are almost certainly doing better than you think. And a little bit of that is just because what I had talked about before, the sheer amount of podcasts that there are. But just to give you some perspective, in general, if your episodes are getting 25 to 30 episode downloads or plays in the first few days after the release, you're already in the top 50% of podcasters. Again, there is about 4 to 5 million podcasts, probably a million of which almost nobody listens to. So it is a little bit skewed. But when I tell people that, they do oftentimes feel relieved, especially with shows that I'm auditing who feel like they're not really hitting the mark, or shows that have recently launched and it takes them a while to build up an audience. So yeah, I think it's really important to have that perspective. So yeah, 25 to 30 downloads per week, or like within, a week's time of you releasing an episode, is actually pretty good. And it's a great place to start from. Like I said, the podcast landscape is really vast. So a lot of shows struggle to build a consistent audience at all. So if you're experiencing that yourself, don't feel bad. Just take in some of the advice we're talking about today, do a little bit of that detective work that I talk about, and you can come up with a growth plan that will slowly over time help build your performance. In general, I will just say for a lot of the people who are newer to podcasting out here, it takes 1 to 2 years of consistent posting, having a regular cadence, whether that's weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, and then consistently posting and promoting. And then what we're talking about today, which is taking your analytics and coming up with a growth plan based on your analytics and kind of being able to be flexible with how your show and your content is structured because of that. So if you really nail down those things, you will start to see growth over time and you'll build an audience. But it is really hard to grow an audience if you're not like, a celebrity or somebody who already has, hundreds of thousands of followers on social media or whatever it might be. So the biggest point I want to make here, that it's really, really important to have a very engaged audience, and it's way more valuable than having a large passive audience. So you can have, 100,000 listeners, but if nobody's commenting, nobody's responding, people aren't coming back week to week, it's not even as helpful as having, like 100 people who tune in every single week and are, making comments and signing up for your newsletter and being really engaged. So it's really about a mindset shift to focus on serving your current audience really, really well, rather than obsessing over like constantly growing. You want to, of course, keep an eye on both. Like you want to be able to grow, but honestly, the more time you spend focusing on giving the most value to a smaller engaged audience, that is going to inherently help you grow, because people are, once word gets out that this is actually like a valuable podcast to listen to, that's leading with a value for your audience, it's going to naturally grow because people are going to share it. People are going to want to come on the show, So, yeah, just don't get discouraged too much if you're not doing as good as you would have thought, and just make sure that you're focusing on serving your current audience, small as it might be. All right. So yeah, I hope that hits home with some people. All right. So moving on to something that everyone is always curious about, but nobody really likes to hear about, which is monetization thresholds. So this is kind of when advertisers start to pay attention. Um, you know, so before we get too far into this, I do want to mention that a lot of people have success when they're early on monetizing their small audience through listener-based monetization methods. Like Patreon is going to be the biggest one. And so it's basically like people can pay $5 a month or whatever amount that you set to get whatever exclusive content that you give them. So that can be anything from like a full bonus episode to just like a 10-minute, solo episode from the host to, blog posts or, extra content, et cetera, et cetera. When people are first starting off and they have a small engaged audience, that is a great way to get a little bit of monetization so that you can put that back into the show, so that you can pay for an editor or you can pay for like promo posts or et cetera, et cetera. So just before you get too discouraged about the insane amount of downloads that you have to get to actually make your podcast profitable, a lot of people have built themselves up that way through Patreon or through Buy Me a Coffee. There's a few other Patreon similar ones, but Patreon's going to be the most audience recognized one. But yeah, I just want to talk about this just to make sure that people have an understanding of what it takes to actually make money doing this. And it is doable. It definitely takes some time, and it kind of depends on where you're at. So it takes about 10,000 monthly downloads to open up sponsorship doors before advertisers are even interested. So the industry standard is called a CPM, or cost per mile. It usually sits at about $15 to $35 per 1,000 listens. So if you're not even getting 1,000 listens, nobody's really going to be interested in advertising with you. And I think bigger podcasting monetization platforms, like Spotify Partner Program is one of the best ones. You're going to need to get at least that before you can even sign up for it. And they have all sorts of different metrics that you have to hit before even being invited to it. Well, you have to have a certain amount of listener hours. You have to have a certain amount of listener hours just on Spotify, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, we can talk about the monetization ladder, which is 1,000 downloads plus you're in a great position to do premium content and start something on Patreon. You can actually even be a lot less than that, because if you have 500 people and 50 of them sign up and they're willing to pay you $5 a month, like that goes a long way into paying for some of your production costs or into paying for promo or whatever else it might be. But generally, if you're at about 1,000 downloads, you're in a really good position for Patreon and direct support. Once you get to about $5,000 or 5,000 downloads, you can potentially reach out to direct sponsorship. Once you're getting up towards that $10,000 level, that's when podcast networks might start to be interested, because then they can help leverage like all of their skills to help promote the show and kind of grow a little bit. Obviously, they're going to take a big cut of the advertising money, but that's when you get to that point is when that can kind of be possible. So a lot of times when I'm doing audits, people ask me about like, well, how do I get on one of these networks where they just kind of like help me do all the promo and everything for me? It's like you really have to get to that point of downloads on your own before anyone will even be interested. Once you get towards the 50,000 plus downloads monthly, you can start to get premium advertising rates. So like I was saying, there's that range of between 15 and 35 CPM, which is the amount that you get per 1,000 downloads. You'll definitely be on the higher end of that if you're getting 50 plus thousand downloads monthly. The other thing is that when you're doing host read ads and you're at a place like that, 50,000 plus, you can ask for a lot more. So I've seen for up to $200 per CPM for host read ads. So what typically happens in most podcast advertising is it's just what's called dynamic ad insertion, which that's when you work with one of these companies like Red Circle or the Spotify partner program I was talking about, where basically they just randomly insert whatever advertisers, selected the genre of podcast that you're in, and they'll just randomly put 2 or 3 ads in your show. And so those pay that, kind of standard rates that I had mentioned, 15 to 35 CPM. But then if you're doing host read ads, which is the host, it's more of like what you might hear like on a radio show where they talk about the product and they talk about how maybe they personally experienced it. Usually they'll like send you some freebies so you can try them out and like be a little bit more authentic about your experience with whatever product it is. But once you get to that point, that's going to be where you're most able to monetize the most money and really actually think about making it into a career, or, at least have it be more profit driven than most podcasts are. So ultimately the strategy is just to build towards these thresholds. While on the side, you can also develop other revenue streams. And there's a lot of ways to do that, like merch, etc. I will say that Patreon has a really great program where you basically just upload your logo and then they will one-off print merch for you, whether it's a sticker or a button or a t-shirt, based on certain levels of support from your audience. So that's a really great thing for people who are just starting off and they know they're not going to sell 500 t-shirts and the t-shirt company is telling them you have to buy 500 at once to get this discount, whatever it is. They print and ship them off one at a time. So that's another great strategy. But in general, these thresholds, like this monetization ladder, is something good to keep in mind as you're actively monitoring your downloads and seeing kind of where you are in comparison to this monetization ladder. So I hope that helps everyone get a decent sense of like where they're at and where they should be going and what they can expect overall with podcast monetization. All right, so move on to the next one here. I'm going to take a big sip of my TPC branded mug here. Okay, so geographic and demographic insights, knowing your audience better to serve them better. So I will say, and this is just true about basically every analytic and data point that we're talking about, depending on your RSS feed host, there's a wide variety of what information you actually have available to you. So again, I keep going back to Spotify and Apple because they're like where the majority of people's listens come from, other than YouTube, which is kind of a separate thing because YouTube videos are different than podcasts, but it's starting to be one of the top places that people go for podcasts. And that's a whole nother thing to talk about as far as like creating video podcasts. We do have a lot of really great info on our blog about that. So if anyone wants to check that out, there's tons of articles about, how to become a video podcast, things to know about YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. But I say all that to say that not every RSS feed host, so like your Acast or your Blueberry or your Captivate, et cetera, have exactly what we're going to be talking about today. But Spotify for creators and Apple for podcast for creators do have really great demographic information. So with Spotify specifically, they can actually give age and gender data, which most other podcasts don't. It might not necessarily be helpful to you unless you are getting to that point where you can pitch to a network or to an advertiser, because they're going to want to be targeting, a specific age range, a specific gender, etc. So it can be super helpful there, and that's where you can find it. Unfortunately, the way that they get that is just people can optionally, when they sign up, say, I'm male, female, I live here, I live there. And it's only specific to Spotify. The geographic location, however, is going to be available from everywhere. So if you are listening on any different podcast platform, it's going to be available. The geographic information is going to be available. But Apple and Spotify for sure both do a great job of like making it easy to find. Here's your top 10 countries, and here's even your top 10 cities, etc., which can be really helpful. So for content, demographic insights help with like localization and cultural relevance. So if like 60% of your audience is in the Pacific time zone, scheduling like a live episode or a Q&A session, it becomes much clearer like when you should do that. So that's one example. If your audience skews towards like a particular age range, you can kind of adjust your references and communication styles. Although I will say most times people tend to be drawn towards like their own generation. So like I wouldn't necessarily recommend if you do have a younger audience, trying to really use Gen Z lingo and stuff like that, because it won't come across as authentic. But it is good to know in general, like who you're dealing with, who your audience is, for a variety of reasons when you're doing content planning, whether it's guest booking, or the type of places that you post your social media content, like Instagram versus LinkedIn versus TikTok, is really based on kind of like an age range demographic. So that can be super helpful. For business applications, though, it can be really important talking about geographic concentration. So it can help with like live event and meetup planning. Demographic profiles assist with sponsorship, matching, and partnership opportunities. So that's, of course, important when you get to that point. And then understanding your audience in general just informs like your product development. So if you're creating courses, you're creating books, or you have consulting services, all this is going to be really important for you to know who your target market for that is, as well as outside of the podcast. So I would say the key data points to track are age ranges. Again, that's going to be harder to find other than outside of Spotify, but it is still helpful, as Spotify is like usually top 2 or top 3 for all podcasts as far as like what platforms people are listening on. But then, yeah, of course, geographic concentration, listening devices. You can actually see if people are listening like online on their desktop or on their mobile app. And you can also see where people are listening to, like on what platform, whether it's Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, if it's Spotify or Apple. So that's really helpful to know too. There's kind of different listener and behavior habits on Spotify versus Apple. I mean, a good example of that, I guess, would be is that Spotify has a lot more kind of like promotional tools that are better for like discovery. So they, again, like I said, they have a really great video integration. So you can actually upload clips to each Spotify episode, just the same way that you would upload like an Instagram video clip or something. And so as you're scrolling, you're going to see like that video clip, versus on Apple Podcasts where you'd have to like do a couple clips to get to the episode description to like read what it's all about. Whereas on Spotify, you're just scrolling up and it like will automatically start playing that. And that's another tool that you can utilize if you sign up for Spotify for podcasters. So if you see that, the majority of my listeners are on Spotify, maybe I should start to utilize some of these tools. And if they are not, then you wouldn't really have to worry about it so much. But yeah, it's just things like that that I think will ultimately help guide some of the ways that you set up your growth plan for your podcast. And if you end up making any changes, you'll have a good reason to do it. All right. So I hope that clears up some stuff there about geographic and demographic insights. Again, happy to answer any questions afterwards. All right, platform performance comparison. So this is what I was mentioning before. You can see this is actually from Spotify. You can see in the corner there's 42% Apple Podcast, 35% Spotify. That's generally a good example of most podcasts. Like I said, it's usually the 1, 2, and 3 of podcast platforms are going to be Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. So I already kind of talked a little bit about this, but some platforms, like I said, favor discovery, which I think is more suited to Spotify, while others build loyalty for shows that people already follow. So that's another good example, is how Apple will basically, once you follow a show, it's always going to end up, every time there's a new episode, it's going to end up in your home feed. So like when you open the app, the first thing you're going to see is like, oh, these 4 or 5 shows that you subscribe to just put out, here are their most recent episodes. So what that ends up doing is it helps to create more of a loyal following. So because people are going to be listening more regularly, because it's just like always there in their face, like, oh yeah, another episode, like constantly reminding them. So that's better, I would say, for retaining like regular listeners as an audience of dedicated listeners, whereas Spotify is more suited for growth and discovery. So that's just something to keep in mind as you start to look at these numbers. And again, this is specifically from Spotify. It might look different on whatever RSS feed host you're using, but you can also get this data, and then you can also get this data from Apple. And Apple's looks a little bit different, but it's essentially the same thing. Like, here's the breakdown of where people are listening. So yeah, the engagement quality varies by platform. Some platforms favor discovery, others loyalty. Platform-specific features impact the listener experiences, which is what I'm talking about with like the surveys and the comments on Spotify. So yeah, basically understanding these differences will help optimize your strategy in the future. All right, so subscriber growth patterns. This is something that like I end up talking about a lot in both my audits and launches. So just to share some real world data, realistic benchmark for like a B2B podcast, which is a lot of the people that we work with, is about 15 new subscribers per month and about a 10% monthly download growth rate. It's really hard to say because what an average is, but typically like what I've seen from the shows that I work with who are kind of like following instructions and promoting things right and having good guests and generally like doing a good job, following everything that they should be, they'll see typically about 10 to 20 subscribers monthly. And that's combined on all platforms. So you can see that data specifically combined on most RSS platforms. But again, to get all of this data, you might have to sign up for both Apple and Spotify for creators, which again, you don't have to change your RSS feed host. You can sign up for those, like using that email thing that I talked about before. And they will show you, okay, here's your Apple specific subscribers for this month. Here's your Spotify specific ones for this month. And then occasionally some RSS feed hosts will just show you them combined, but it varies wildly. So if all of you are comfortable with your current RSS feed host, you can totally keep using that. Otherwise, it might be helpful to look around and see what other platforms are out there. I really like Captivate. I think it's very helpful. Blueberry does have a lot of nice features as well. They have great customer service. We have a ton of things written about how to choose your RSS feed host in our blogs. So I encourage people to look at that too. But just to know that you can find this data in a variety of ways. And then, of course, YouTube is a big thing too. Like they use Google Analytics. So they have really great analytics in general. With everything from completion rates, you can see exactly when people stopped listening. And then subscriber growth is really important to measure those too. But in general, I would say like this is typically how it goes for the first year or two. About 15 subscribers a month is a great thing to shoot for. 10% monthly download growth rate is totally reasonable and is an expectation that you can set for yourself. All right, so moving on to the final thing here, which is actionable response framework. So this is just kind of, wanting to make sure that you realize that the important thing that we're talking about here is turning your data into decisions that make your podcast better and make sure that your audience fits better and that for that audience, you're giving them the best value. So metrics are kind of worthless without action plans. So what I've recommended for a lot of people that I'm doing audits with is to create specific trigger points that prompt concrete changes to your podcast strategy and your content. So for example, if your completion rate drops below 50% for like consecutive episodes, you can review your episode structure maybe. If growth stalls for 3 or 4 months, you should maybe reassess your content strategy. If platform performance significantly diverges from your baseline, maybe adjust your distribution focus. Like maybe you focus more on YouTube or Spotify and do video content. If you notice demographic shifts, you can evaluate whether your content is still actually relevant to your target audience, or maybe you have a different target audience. So the key is just to set up like monthly metric reviews, which I have a blog post that talks about that too. that has some really good information there. But to have these monthly metric reviews, but then also have like predetermined action thresholds, right? So like I described, if you get below a certain metric, then you're going to want to have this action plan in place, change towards video or whatever it might be. So this is just will ensure like continuous improvement rather than like passive monitoring. Like you can look at all this data, but if you don't have an action plan, if you get past or below a certain threshold, then it's not really doing you any good. So, yeah, I guess overall, I just want to make sure that people know to remember the goal isn't to achieve like perfect numbers immediately. It's to create a system where data consistently drives improvement in your show. Yeah, so I hope that's helpful for everyone. I know there's a lot of information there. So again, feel free to ask any questions. We'll get to Q&A shortly, and then feel free to follow up. So the 3-step process, this is just a way to like have a plan for your analytics that it's pretty simple. So tracking what matters, focusing on completion rates, listen through rates, and engage growth. Setting realistic benchmarks, using that industry specific data that to set achievable goals. So that's kind of like where I was talking about who you're comparing yourself to and like how you're setting your goals and kind of like what the realistic amount of downloads is. And then creating response systems. So what we had just talked about, establishing trigger points that prompt specific improvements. So, but yeah, again, just to reiterate, great podcasts are built on understanding and serving their audience, not chasing, again, the vanity metrics thing. All right, so I think that kind of clarifies. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. I do want to mention I have tons of webinars, guides, checklists, and articles all on our website, and the blog posts, hundreds and hundreds of really in-depth, detailed articles that talk about a lot of the things that we covered today. And then we also have a YouTube channel that has all of the webinars that we've ever done, which will include this one. And then a bunch of really great stuff from one of our amazing audio and video editors, Quinn. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. I'm going to go ahead and check out the chat here and see what kind of questions we have. And then we will go from there. So from Jerry, we have, what is the best host for analytics? So again, and just so people know, RSS feed host is basically where you go to sign up to distribute your podcast everywhere. I would say there isn't a perfect solution for that, which is why, throughout the conference, I was saying, get both Spotify for creators and Apple for creators because they have some of the best data. Spotify for creators is a really good option, I would say, because you get everything that's included in all their extra services for promotion and discovery. It's 100% free. There's no uploads, but it's kind of basic as far as like some of the uploading features, etc. But yeah, that's usually half the time when I'm doing launches, that's what I end up using for people, because then you automatically have access to all those features, and then going on and doing Apple Podcast for Creators to get the other Apple specific stuff. It almost doesn't matter at this point which you choose. I would just say figure out what services are most important to you, what your cost and budget is, and check out our blog for the article that talks about that, because it kind of lays out what every RSS feed host has to offer, what their services cost, and all the specifics, and you can kind of like decide there, because it really depends on what kind of podcast you have and what your goals are. But in general, I think if you're just starting off, or even if you just want to like stop paying the $20 to $50 a month you're paying for your hosting services, Spotify Creators is a great option. So I would recommend checking that out. One more here. It's asking about IAB. Okay, yeah. So IAB is the Interactive Advertising Bureau. And again, what they do is they basically just have standardized how download and other metric data is collected to make sure that it's legitimate. Again, like a lot of, I think it's Captivate has this and Blueberry has this too, I think, where it will show you the IAB downloads versus the non-IAB downloads. And you can actually get a sense of like, okay, this is how much like spam and people scraping my info actually affects my download numbers. So I would recommend checking those and kind of like going back and forth and seeing what those numbers are. But basically, IAB is just like to get a more accurate measure of the downloads, which is important. But however, I think we should still not necessarily only focus on that. Like the point of the presentation is really set not to focus on just those vanity download numbers, but to focus on things that actually provide like engagement numbers, so you can actually see what is making a difference in your audience versus just, these numbers. But if you do want to have like an accurate count of your downloads, make sure that they are IAB certified, or that you're using a host that's IAB certified. So, all right. I don't think there's any other questions here. So yeah, let's go ahead and wrap it up. But again, thank you everybody for joining. I hope you found some helpful info there. I know Robin has been putting some resources in the chat, so hopefully some of you can take advantage of that. But if not, like I said, our blog post, our YouTube channel are all linked on our website and have some really great information there. So please take advantage of that. And then, yeah, we're always happy to chat with anybody, even if it's about stuff outside of what we talked about today. We're a full podcast production service. We have all sorts of services that we can help you with. A lot of knowledgeable staff. So feel free to reach out to us via email if you have any questions that didn't get answered today. And thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you have a great podcast journey.